life course stream. He is also an assistant professor in the Department of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy here at the University of Toronto. And we're so glad to be here today to talk about his research and take it away.
Thank you very much, Susan. So thank you all for coming. I should start off just by acknowledging my committee. Audra Cole, Judy Friedland, and Stephen Katz. I'm very, very fortunate to be working with that group of people. They're wonderful to work with, so it's great. And also just to acknowledge the Social Sciences and Research Council of Canada for funding my graduate work. So Queering the Life course, Life Histories of Older Gay Men Living in Rural Areas in Alberta. Now I need to preface this with the notion that I'm not going to be speaking definitively. This is a work in progress, so I'm hoping, though, that the questions that I'm asking as I'm going along will be of use to you. Okay? A little bit more about the study. If we can get the... what's happened? One moment, please. There we go. So first of all, I'm going to go through a little bit of background as to what brought me to this project. I'll do a brief introduction to queer theory, and I know some of you have talked about an interest in queer theory and want to hear a little bit about it, so I'm going to introduce it, and hopefully with pulling on some of the stories, the narratives of the people that I worked with, I'll be able to maybe with you, with some discussion, discuss some of those concepts that maybe are illustrated in the stories. The study's grounded within life course principles. I'm not going to be focusing or talking a lot about life course principles. You'll see some of the principles and ideas and concepts come up through the discussion. I'll introduce you to life history methodology. We'll talk about 2 participants. I'm working with 3, but I'm going to talk about 2. Now this is the bulk of the presentation, the stories. Unlike maybe other forms of qualitative research, the voice of the participants is really privileged. It's much more privileged. I won't just be talking, I'm using a series of quotes. I'm drafted what I hope gives you a sense of who these people are, using a combination of their words and my words. So it's a co-construction of their stories. Then we'll take another look at some of the queer concepts that were illustrated. I'll talk a little bit about my questions around queer theory, because I'm really exploring the use of this in my study. And I'm not quite completely convinced yet. And I'd really be interested in hearing some of your thoughts as well. And then further questions arising from the topic. So I know you're interested in the differences between gay men and older straight men. I don't think that I'll be able to definitively talk about key differences. There's so many differences within the gay community as well. But hopefully you'll have some questions from the stories that come up. Starting points. I've worked for many, many years, since I was about 18, with older adults in a variety of capacities as a personal care attendant, later as a student, an occupational therapist, now as an occupational therapist, and now as an instructor in occupational therapy. Particularly had an interest in diversity and aging. How people are included, how people are excluded, what impact that has on their aging process, what impact that has on their health. From an occupational therapist perspective, I'm always interested in what people are doing and how they're connected through their communities, to their families, to their communities, through their doings. How are they connected? So that's where I can never, the occupational perspective is always there, and it certainly influences how I'm reading and understanding the stories that I'm hearing from my participants. There's certainly an autobiographical influence on this work. As with life history research, unlike other forms of some types of qualitative research where you're encouraged to bracket out your own personal perspectives, my perspective, my story is integrated right into the analysis process. So my experience as a gay man growing up in a rural area in rural Alberta is very much tied into this, and hopefully the readers, the participants, share in that process of pulling apart what's my place, where's my role in the analysis, and how's my voice influenced, and how does my relationship with the person I'm interviewing, how does that influence the analysis process. And also finally, and I think related to questions of diversity, inclusion, and exclusion is the idea of whose stories are being told and whose stories are not being told. I was always very tuned into that. I knew my story wasn't being told, my story as a gay man in a rural area, and I always considered or questioned or wondered how other people's stories from various minorities, how their stories were not celebrated or heard. And again, what does that do to your sense of who you are and what you do as you age? So this is a work in progress. Using life history, I want to, there's a number of things that I'm hoping to explore, but particularly what are those contextual influences on the changing community and family participation over time of the participants I'm speaking to. And this is where queer theory comes in. What role does sexuality play in people's life decisions, trajectories, whatnot, their choices over time? But underlying that, and probably a little bit, maybe the primary purpose of today's discussion is, does queer theory, is it helpful in helping me understand or explain or make sense of the stories that I'm hearing? So I'm hoping to make the link. I won't be speaking a lot about the literature, the gay and lesbian literature on aging. There is a growing literature on older gay and lesbians, bisexual, transgender people. But there's very seldom, it was a surprise to me that there are so few references to queer theory. I would have thought they'd be connected, but they're certainly not. Reasons why they're not has become much clearer. But there's also a rich queer theory literature, mostly from the humanities, but there's very few, if any, references to the experiences of older people and the experience of sexuality over time, over a life course. And so what happens when we link those two? Perspective, queer theory perspective, and life course on aging. So just this, I'm sure this is a concept familiar to most of you here, but just to review, this is all I'll be saying explicitly about the life course. But basically aging is studied in the long term over the life course, basically. And it looks at the impact of social relationships, individual biography, and shifting historical and contextual influences on the timing of life transitions and trajectories. My understandings of life courses have basically been informed for the most part by these key authors here, Brunner, Elder, and Sederston. So queer theory, a bit of background. Queer theory has its roots in the humanities and literary and cultural criticism. So it's an entirely different way of looking at the world, what we know, how we come to know. There's been very little dialogue between queer theory with its where it's situated within the humanities and social sciences, health sciences, clinical sciences in particular, absolutely clinical sciences. It grew out of the humanities and was also developing at a time of social movements, LGBT studies, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender studies in the 70s and 80s and whatnot, which took much more of a social science perspective on the understandings of what it means to be gay or lesbian. So it shares, and it's developed from a postmodern understanding with the identification of how discourses, how we talk about things, and how power is conveyed through discourse, the way that we talk about things, how that shapes personal narratives, how that informs how we tell the stories that we tell, how it shapes identity, if we understand story to be part of who we are. But what's different about queer theory, I guess it's add-on, is sexuality. So how do we then take a sexual lens and look at how discourses around sexuality shape behavior and relationships and whatnot? Queer theory, as with other postmodernists, challenges the dichotomies. Okay? It rejects the idea that the world is made up of black and white or wrong, dualisms or binaries, man or woman, male or female, gay or straight. Okay? It would reject those as being overly simplistic and limiting in so far as how they limit human potential. Queer theorists would challenge the notion of any fixed or essentialist notion of sexuality and identity. The idea that we're not born, we're not necessarily born man, woman, or born gay, straight, that we learn over time through discourse, through structures, to become or to perform certain roles. Which, I used the word perform. Judith Butler, who is one of the primary writers on queer theory, talks about or uses the idea of performative theory. And it was quite a read. I challenge you to take a look at it. Some of you have. It's very dense. My take on performativity theory is the idea that identity development, whether that's gay or lesbian identity development as a man or woman, is the result of how power is conveyed through discourse and how our relationships are regulated by society's regulating structures. So if you think of Foucault's talked a lot about medicine, education, religion as those regulated forces that shape who we are and who we become. So through those structures, which are reinforced by discourse and how we talk about certain things or certain identities or certain ways of being, we're offered a limited choice of ways of being or identities. So taking that further to looking at the lesbian experience, the options for gay and lesbian identities are rather limited in the sense that they, in some ways, can maintain. We always need an other. The dominant forces in society, if they have an other, then that defines better who they are. So the dominant heterosexual identity is reinforced by having an other, which it shapes and controls through language, through regulative discourse. Is that clear? Does that make sense? It's a starting point at least. We can pick up on it later. Eve Sedgwick, another who's written a lot on queer theory, talks about the difference between a universalizing theory and a minoritizing theory. So she would criticize LGBT studies for what she sees as a minoritizing approach. So by reinforcing a certain way of being or a certain way of identity, we ghettoize, or we put people off to the side and limit the relevance of that experience to the broader world. Contrary to that is a universalizing approach, which would understand ideas of sexuality, of homosexuality, of heterosexuality, as having relevance for a broader, for everyone. So it challenges, although the people within the human rights world would say, well, this takes away if we have no identity, then how do we organize and how do we fight against oppression? I'm not sure how effectively that's answered. It's on the table for sure. Angelides talks about relational influences on identity. So similar to performativity, but that we learn to become who we are by those who we connect with and who we identify with. And those ways of being, those ways of performing are further reinforced. And there's some, I think, wonderful examples or illustrations of this in the stories that I'm going to tell. The aims of queer theory, as Warner and Sedgwick emphasize, it's not a theory about queers, it's about queer in theory. Queer theory is not meant to help us understand the experience of lesbian, gay, and bisexuals. Okay? But it can be useful to break apart the categories and essentialist thinkings or undertones of any aspect of theory. Okay? So from that, people talk about queering religion, or queering the academy, or queering education. So how do we look at those spheres with the lens of sexuality and are critical of the sexualist undertones? So it also exposes and critiques underlying cultural structures for regulating sexual behavior in all disciplines, and challenges and resists and breaks down any categories thought to be eliminated. Now, so any questions about queer theory? And I'm still in the learning process with queer theory journal. I'm still trying to make sense of it. It's might be a lifelong process for sure.
Barry, we have one request from the web audience. We don't have a body microphone, but would you be able to elevate a little bit the volume of your voice so that they can hear better?
Certainly, I will try. How's this? Okay. Get after me if I start fading away.
Thank you.
Switching now over to a little bit around what we need to be thinking about when we're looking at the life course of anyone. Social conditions change over time and they shape who we are, obviously. And there's been a lot written about various major events in the life course of people in their 70s and 80s and whatnot. And we usually hear, particularly in North America, around World War II, the Depression, those kinds of things, which certainly all of my participants who are 70 plus would have experienced. But in addition there, I think there's a number of unique changing social conditions that have impacted on their life course. And I just want to highlight a few of those. They've been written about in the literature. And some of you may be quite familiar with this. So pre-post Stonewall. For those of you who don't know what Stonewall is, Stonewall was seen to be the beginning of the gay lesbian liberation movement in North America. It started, took place in 1969 at a bar in New York City, where a bar that was repeatedly harassed and raided by police. So at one evening, in June of 1969, primarily drag queens got out in full force and fought back. There was a riot that went on for 3 or 4 days in the news. It brought gay people out of their closet, basically. And often when people are looking at different experiences of older gay men in particular and women, probably to a lesser extent around the Stonewall piece, they look at, okay, where were these people situated pre or post Stonewall? Okay, how that is going to shape who they are and their understanding of their identity. Pre-post AIDS, again, how sexuality is understood from that perspective. Okay, it's been thought that post AIDS, that the notion of sexuality within the gay community as a very liberating force became much more conservative. People became much more conservative in how they understood sexuality and how they expressed sexuality. The open debate within faith communities recently, and this had a particular effect on my participants and brought things out of the closet, particularly people who had identified around religious communities. Incredible changes in federal provincial legislation in the lifetime of these participants who are now in their 70s. So discrimination and inclusion in the Human Rights Code, decriminalization, same-sex marriage, survivor benefits, adoption rights, so much has happened. But we're not there yet. And I was reminded of that very quickly when I was in Alberta. I had heard of a research project that was done a number of years ago. It was a series of life stories done with not just older gay lesbians, but any gay or lesbian person who was willing to come forward. There were a number of them done. And they're hidden away in a museum in Red Deer. It's very difficult to get at this report. The officials in the Alberta government at the time tried to shut it down and tried to take funding away. This was just a few years ago, 2002. It's very limited access to this report. It's never been published. There's been a lot of fear around it. So that was a wake-up call for when I was going back to do this kind of research. Life course considerations for older gay men, identity shifts. There's been a lot written. Actually, Michael Kennedy, who some of you may know, who did his PhD here, just finished last year, I think, did wide-level survey on gay men living in rural areas. He speaks a lot about the differences in identity development between gay men living in rural areas and gay people living in urban areas. But even within urban areas currently, there's been quite a shift as far as geographically. No longer are gay people ghettoized within one particular area, but there's been much more of a dispersal across cities as their feeling of safety has improved. Online social networking has been a huge shift, which connects people in many ways. The youth focus and marginalization of seniors as the group of particularly urban older gay men increases their sense of disconnection with the gay community. There's been a lot written about ageism within the gay community. Differences over time in how gay identity should or could be expressed. So if you think back, before Stonewall, a lot of discussion around the sort of butch femme sort of ways of being was more prominent with women, but still was expressed within the gay community. After Stonewall, a promotion of much more of a masculine way of being. So if you think back to the Village People, YMCA, the song that you're all familiar with, it's played at every wedding. I always wonder how many people know that this is a parody on gay culture in New York City. But it was parodying the masculine identity. But now, although I haven't seen much written about this, but if I look at who's shaping, who's regulating how gay people express who they are, I think of the market, I think of consumerism, I think of designer guys, I think of triage of straight folk. I mean, the norm or the expectations around how you're supposed to be a gay person. I was challenged if I was really gay because I am so impaired when it comes to creating home regulations. Maybe I'm not really gay. Further life course considerations. Sederson talks a lot about unique gay status passages, and I think there are some unique gay passages, status passages for older gay people. If you think about the impact, like timing of coming out for gay people is a big deal. It's a huge shift. It can be very painful, but most often it's incredibly liberating, and it changes the way people look at things. Now, coming out doesn't happen at one point. We're always coming out to a certain extent. The people in my study came out much later in life. They came out in the 40s. The idea of crisis competence, it's been suggested that, like other minority groups, that older gay men, because they've had to deal with particular issues challenges throughout life, may have developed certain competencies to deal with ongoing crises. Now, all of these studies, because there's been so few studies done, we really need to take them with a grain of salt, right? And because the people that they've been talking to are the people that it's been easier to get hold of, mostly urban, gay, white. Certainly there's questions around the negative status applied to older gay men within the gay culture. There's a lot of very derogatory terms for older gay men that keep people in place. Alternative to that is the question of the influence of money as a form of power and identity for older gay men as an alternative identity, potentially. The idea of linked lives, there's been a lot of concern expressed in the literature around how are older gay men in particular going to manage in their old age, given that an estimated 40% over 65 are single. So what impact does that have? Also, the notion that many may be disconnected from their biological families. Not all, many, but if we're thinking about this particular cohort, perhaps more in urban settings again. However, there's been a lot also discussed on the unique role of friendships for gay men and women, and how you may have heard the term chosen family, how people, because they are connected through an alternative identity, develop another stronger connections. How long those connections and bonds hold as people grow older is up for grabs at this point. Some suggestion that older gay people may disconnect more from the gay community with its youth focus as they grow older. Again, possibilities. So now turning to my study, what I've been talking about, history methodology. Just a bit of background. How most people familiar with life history? A few of you are, for sure. Basically, situated, according to some, within a narrative research method, however, that goes beyond narrative. It goes beyond just the story itself and tries to interrogate or understand or pull out how contextual influences shape people's lives and shape the stories that they tell. Hopefully, if a life history is successful, it will challenge conventional stories that are being told about various groups. It reflects a social constructivist perspective. So, as I think I mentioned earlier, the stories that you're going to be hearing later have been through co-constructions. We put them together. It's a little bit of my take, it's a little bit of their take. There's a lot of back and forthing to get a sense of, does this fit with who you are? Does this resonate with your sense of who you are? Life history, because it's not about doing an hour-and-a-half interview and moving on. The relationship is absolutely central in life history research, because the trust needs to be there. Time needs to be taken to develop that trust and to explore in depth people's feelings and experiences. Hopefully there's some sense of give and take within the life history project. So I've negotiated a lot with what is it, the outcome that the participants who I'm working with, what are they looking for? What do they want to do with this life history? Where's it going to go? So there's that piece, putting together their story, and then there's the part that I need to spend more time on, and how is this, what does the story tell us about broader themes, which they may or may not be involved in. Reflexivity, of course, is very important here. How does my story influence the story, but also how does our changing relationship change the nature of the story that's being told? Every now and again, my mouse runs away. I'm not sure why that happens. But we'll find it. It's very odd. One moment, please. Something happened there. So I'm going to introduce you to two people. John, which I see as a story about resistance, and Martin, which speaks to me at this point, a story of adaptation. Before I do that, I want to take you to that place or that time. I want to give you a sense of how we were talking about homosexuality at that time. And, you're going to hear much more about who these people are, their age, where they're from in a moment, if I can find my mouse.
You can also use the arrow button to the right and or click on the mouse to move to the next slide.
Click on, because I can't even get my, oh. No. Sorry. There we go.
The 19th chapter of Genesis in the Old Testament contains the story of Lot and the city of Sodom. But the men put forth their hand and pulled Lot into the house to them and shut to the door. The rest of the story is well known. Lot took his family and his guests out of Sodom, and God destroyed the city with brimstone and fire from heaven. Thus was Sodom and the practice of homosexuality judged.
Do you think that they are in any way a danger to our society?
I believe they are, in my own humble opinion. I think so.
How do you see them being dangerous?
Well, I guess all I can go by is what I've really read in the paper.
Well, it's just like anybody else. I think they should be locked up.
You think that they should be put away? Do you think that they're a danger, a menace?
Yes, definitely.
And what do you suggest we could do about them other than locking them up?
Well, you could give them homes like they do for the mentally insane.
What is your own personal attitude towards homosexuals? One of live and let live, or?
Well, live and let live by all means, but I think a very heavy penalty indeed in all cases where older people are, I suppose corrupting is the only word we can use, corrupting young people. I think there should be a severe penalty.
Would you like to see some real changes in our attitudes as expressed in law toward homosexuals?
Yes, I would. I don't think it should be ever put into the criminal code. I think it should be taken out. It should be done in a medical way, so that these people can be sent to centers if we feel as citizens who oppose the feeling of this illness and this homosexuality, so they can be rehabilitated.
What would a really liberal homosexual bill say?
Well, of course, to draft legislation on TV takes some doing. But I think, first of all, we should have an interview with psychiatrists, psychologists, and those professional people, so that these people have an equal opportunity in society, with a right, above all, for rehabilitation. I don't want to encourage homosexuality. I abhor it. But the fact is, where it exists, and there's no rehabilitation, there may be some people you can't rehabilitate them.
Do you think a loosening of laws around homosexuality would in fact create an increasing interest in homosexuality and a greater chance of it in the community?
No, because you can't legislate norms any more than prohibition worked 50 years ago or 25 years ago. You can't drive. They passed a law tomorrow that no man and woman in Canada for 5 years could sleep together. What would happen, Barbara? It's the same thing. You can't force people against human behavior to do something. When you have that,
even though you personally abhor homosexuality,
that's
you
right.
still could vote for this clause.
Oh, yes.
And you could.
It doesn't, to me, it doesn't, as I pointed out at the beginning. We recognize it de facto in Canada now, not de jure, which means we recognize it as a fact. I understand in this city, in Toronto, they have clubs where I've never seen one, but I've heard about it, where they wear girls' clothing and makeup and they carry on. But I am saying the big thing to emphasize is take it out of the code, put it into the medical field to give these people an opportunity.
I think take this thing on homosexuality. I think the view we take here is that there's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation, and I think that what's done in private between adults doesn't concern the criminal code.
So that was a trip back. The first clip was from a half-hour show on CBC called The Psychiatric Illness. That was done in 1959, so 10 years before the laws were changed. The next one was 1969 with Barbara Frum, and it was right around the time where the Omnibus Bill, where they deregulated sexuality and a number of other things at the same time. So that, when I saw these, it took me, not that I was there, well, actually I was sort of there, but not really cognizant, but how we were talking about sexuality, and how we were talking about homosexuality, how we were talking about gay people. And this is the world that the participants who I'm working with, this is the language that they understood. I'm now going to read you some stories, and as I mentioned before, because life history is about privileging the voice of those people who we're speaking to, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time telling the story. Okay, it won't be just a series of quotes. So I want you to sit back and relax and listen to a story or two. Okay, and think about these images while you do. I also have a number of other images that I'm just going to throw up on the screen that hopefully, they were images to me that give some sense of the context. I don't know what they'll mean to you, but we can have a discussion about that afterwards. So, the first story is about John, the farmer, the resistor. Slowly I drive down the steep and winding road that leads into the Red Deer River Valley. It is August, and the surrounding hills are sun-drenched and dry. The banks of the brown, murky Red Deer River are lined with cottonwoods, Manitoba maples, and spindly willows that provide a dark green contrasting border along the river. In the distance, the town of Drumheller, my hometown, spreads out from the river and stretches through the length of the narrow Valley of the Dinosaurs. This hidden Bible Belt Alberta town is situated about 90 kilometers from Calgary and has a reputation as a rough town, dating back to its mining heyday of the 20s and 30s. Today, this town holds about 8,000 people and provides a living for farmers, small businesses catering to the tourist industry, the oil patch, and prison guards. As I get closer to town, the road gets busier, and huge oil rig trucks that compete with the many half-ton pickup trucks drive by. I'm in a borrowed Toyota Yaris. I feel conspicuous. I arrive at a small bungalow with lawn and shrubs neatly groomed. Before I get to the door, I am greeted with a baritone-voiced welcome and an outstretched hand. John's abundant energy is evident immediately. Physically, at age 74, apart from his gray hair, he hasn't changed much since I last saw him some 30 years ago. A tight black shirt hugs his stocky, muscular frame. His khaki shorts and silver-linked neck chain add to his youthful appearance. He would fit very well at any cafe on Church and Wellesley, Toronto, 17th Avenue, Calgary, or Davie Street in Vancouver. I am welcomed into a small living room, filled to capacity with stuffed furniture. John puts on the coffee. I look around. Eclectic artwork lines the walls, along with framed family photographs. It's an ordered house. A few ornaments know their place. Below a large picture window and next to a writing tray are several bird books and crossword dictionaries. My eye is drawn to a grainy black and white photo of a group of school children lined up in order of height. I asked John about it. Those are my schoolmates. We were all in one room, one room from grade 1 to 9. I'm the little one. The photo offers an entry into John's story, and so begins many hours and several sessions of intense shared discovery. Fueled by John's ample supply of homemade scones and muffins, we talk of many things. About his sexuality and aging, his identities, his communities, his friends and family, and perhaps most revealing of all, his decision, his choosing not to fit in. I learned that John was born to Hungarian immigrants in 1934 during the Depression, the dirty 30s. John loved school, but had to quit early, grade 10, due to poor crop conditions. The only boy, he was needed on the farm. This was his duty, he carried on without resentment. And farmed until his first retirement, at age 44. He would have stayed longer, but by this time, even with the many prayers and even occasional attempts to get it right, he had come to acceptance. He was ready to, as he says, check out the big gay world out there. And he could wait no longer to know what it would be like to be held by a tall, skinny cowboy, his long-time secret desire. And so he sold the farm and traveled for several months around North America, on a journey to meet others just like him. He learned much and met many characters on this 3-month trip, and returned to Alberta with a new sense of direction, though without the cowboy mentality. John loved people, and they loved him. He took on a bartending job in Calgary, thinking that this would be a way to meet more people. This was his entry into the gay world, or at least the edge of it. This was one of the most enjoyable and liberating times in my life, John says, and it is when I learned all those things that most gays learn when they're 19 or 20. However, his strong family and community connections pulled him back to drug health. He tells me, I don't like being regulated. A lot of people are only comfortable when they're in a mold because they feel that they belong somehow, and I always felt that I belonged. Why do they think that they have to isolate themselves so much and do not do things with their families and friends, the people that they grew up with? Perhaps for related reasons, John has never really been comfortable with defining himself as gay. I don't ever think I would say that I'm gay, but I would rather say that I have sex with men. You see this labeling, people dislike it. And the reality, I just think that there's more to the truth. There is something about the gay lifestyle, this idea, that somehow we are so different from everybody else. But really, we're not. The only difference is that we want to have sex with them. While in Calgary, John met Michael, a man 20 years his junior. The connection was immediate. Though anxious about moving to a small town, Michael eventually agreed. They were to live together for the next 11 years until Michael's sudden death of a blood clot. John describes this relationship as like a normal family in every way. And it is clear how much John still misses him today, over 15 years later. John continues to be a very dedicated uncle, spending much time helping to support his nieces and nephews and their children. When not with his family, he is doing something for someone else. Caring for a dying neighbor, baking for another, knocking on the doors to raise funds for charity. When I ask about other gay connections or friends in town, he tells me that there are many others, but most are married. There are only a few who he meets occasionally. They are mostly several decades younger than him. For the most part, his gay friends live in large centres in Calgary, Vancouver, Victoria. John's community spans wide. John has a very nurturing quality about him. He looks after a lot of people. He does a lot of things that other small town guys don't usually do. I ask him about this. He tells me, I didn't see why I should have to do something just because it was more manly, or that I couldn't do something if it wasn't manly, or that I had this stupid restriction instead of being who I am. And of course, this was far before I thought anything about homosexuality. I think I've always had confidence in myself in the sense that I never wanted to fit into a pattern. Like growing up, my contemporaries used to say they would start drinking and swearing and all that sort of stuff. You sort of want to fit in. And I thought, if that is what it takes to fit in, I'm not interested, and I won't be popular. I was okay with that. I always felt as an outsider, not just because of that, but also because I was gay. John's sense of difference was always there, but it didn't deter him from doing what he wanted to do. He chuckles when he tells me. My mother would laugh at me when I told her that I wanted to have 12 children. He now laughs at himself when realizing that his childhood fantasy never included a wife. When I ask John about growing older, he responds without hesitation. He tells me that he feels fine, but that others are starting to treat him differently. He describes it like this. When people first meet me, when they first see me, they may like who I am. But if I tell them that I'm gay or that I have sex with men, then suddenly it changes. And age is the same thing. He goes on to share his views on growing older successfully. It's about being able to keep doing things that you're not doing just for you. That it has to involve somebody else. Because I think that gives you a reason for being around. If you are just around to see what you are all about, it just doesn't work. But unlike his straight peers, John tells me that gay men may know something that straight men don't. I'm intrigued, and I'm eager to hear more, though clearly still trying to make sense of this difference. He tells me that having sex with another man can give you an edge somehow, because you're doing something that the rest of society thinks you shouldn't be doing, and you can do it, and you can feel comfortable with it. I don't know how to explain it, but it is in this thought pattern that you use to cope with whatever comes your way each day. The consolidation of growing older is that hopefully I'm a little bit wiser, that I can cope with whatever comes along. That's John and resistance. One more story, very different. This is about Martin, a small town businessman, and it's a story that I see of adaptation.
Just a bit.
Yep. I'm to meet the 70-year-old Martin in his condominium located not far from downtown Channing. Channing is a town of about 12,000 people situated on a flat plain just a few hours outside of Edmonton. It is surrounded with some of the most fertile farmland in Alberta. The condo is a 4-floor walk-up and looks to have been built within the last several years. I enter Martin's sunlit apartment and I'm greeted with a warm welcome by a well-groomed and neatly dressed white-haired man who gestures with quick, energetic motions. His first question is whether I want coffee now or later. While he prepares the coffee, I gaze around the apartment, a very organized and tidy one. When I compliment him on this ordered space, he responds that according to his ex-wife, he's the only person who thinks the kitchen should be as clean as an OR. In his defense, he tells me that his organizational tendencies come from his years as a businessman, where if one was not organized, you wouldn't survive. The apartment's 4 rooms, kitchen, bedroom, living room, and den, are open and bright. An intriguing large painting of a concert scene dominates the small living room, which I make a mental note to ask him about. Books and magazines are neatly organized on shelves and holders. An uncluttered desk takes up space in the center of the living room, a few feet from the kitchen table where I'm asked to take a seat. We fill out the necessary consent forms of which he has no concerns. His no-nonsense response to small-talk introductions gives me the sense that this is a guy on a schedule. He checks his watch and informs me that he has to visit his mother in the nursing home by 11:30, so we jump right into it. He has lots to say and is eager to share. Though he starts out with what he describes as an unhappy childhood with the presence of a belligerent and alcoholic father, and a mother who was distant and unavailable, he shares a life story that is about a successful small-town businessman who is by necessity community-minded, is a caring father, and a generous man who continues to feel happy, socially engaged, free, and healthy. His responses to my questions are consistently decisive, with no hint of ambiguity or uncertainty. I can clearly see the very efficient, organized, and task-oriented businessman who has only limited time for introspection and pondering on the meaning of life. Martin is quick to inform me that I don't think I have a typical gay story, if there is such a thing as a typical gay story. I didn't have any idea of what I was until much later in life, and that is a result of the environment that I lived in. Born in 1930, he grew up in a prairie town of 250 people. His parents were first-generation immigrants from North Dakota. When I ask him about his early significant memories, he responds without hesitation that he has only normal memories. He had a girlfriend. He attended a small country school right up until grade 12 and was married. He lived in a number of small Alberta towns with his wife and daughter. He took frequent trips to Edmonton to get supplies, with a few short stays at the Y, which exposed Martin to a hidden world, one that he was inclined to explore. Martin did not identify as a gay man until his 40s. Though he speaks of numerous same-sex encounters throughout his life, it never occurred to him that this was unusual, or that other boys didn't feel the same way. He recalls no name or label, derogatory or otherwise, that differentiated him from others. He had no sense of being different, and certainly no identification with a marginalized group, nor was he aware of others labeling him so. He described no overt experiences of discrimination, even now as a closeted gay man. He attributes this to good luck and good judgment. Good judgment, I hear later, has much to do with not flaunting it. A tour around his apartment cues Martin to tell me about his interests beyond work and family. He directs me to a large oil painting of a concert scene in the living room that I had noticed earlier. He explains that the painting is taken at the opening of a Calgary music theater. He's a season's ticket holder. Unlike anyone else in my family, he tells me, I've always loved classical music. In fact, as a young boy, Martin would secretly take the place of his sister at her music lessons, much to the anger of his father, who later found out and put a quick stop to this very unboy-like activity. And so his music lessons were short-lived, but as a testament to Martin's continuing passion for classical music, he points to the figure in the large painting, seated in the first balcony box above the stage, and proudly he states, that's me. After his third and final retirement, and now divorced from his wife, Martin expanded his gay connections beyond anonymous sexual encounters. He found connections in larger centers in places like Edmonton, Vancouver, and Palm Springs. When I ask about life in Channing, he begins an enthusiastic description of his weekly Saturday morning breakfast club, a small group of about 16 men and women who get together. Martin was the initiator of these meetings in the early 80s because, in his words, people were very closeted. It was my way of reaching out to people because I knew how difficult it was. People found out about the group through word of mouth, and some through their online connections. Their newest member is a transgendered woman. The revelation clearly surprises me, as I'm intrigued by the fact that there's a transgendered person living in this small town in Alberta. To my surprise, it's not an issue. She's actually very well accepted in the Green Valley Care Home, where she looks after senior citizens. Martin is not aware of any other group in in Channing, finding that most people live there. There's many other gay people, but they're mostly all closeted and very discreet. When I ask if a public meeting is risky for members, I'm told for the most part it's not a problem and that they are careful. But there is at least one member who chooses not to attend because of the public nature of the group. I pick up on Martin's use of the word careful and ask him what it means to be careful with a group of gay peers. He responds with a chuckle and tells me that it is about, keeping it under control. Though having a good sense of what it is that he means, I want to hear him tell me more. So what are you keeping under control? Well, not flaunting it. I push further and ask him to tell me what flaunting it means in Channing, Alberta. Martin responds with more knowing laughter and explains how one of the women in the group keeps an eye on me and lets me know when my wrists are getting too limp. She even has a code gesture. A clenched fist on her chest is a signal that I need to butch it up. Interestingly, he was never self-conscious about his gestures in his life as a married, straight, identified person. I ask him if he resents being more careful. He doesn't see this as a particular issue, as being close to Edmonton there are other venues to connect with other people. He and a group of other people go to a group called Prime Timers, a group for older gay people over 45. In Prime Timers, he divulges, the feminine in us comes out, though we are pretty careful when out with the group. We touch, we call each other he and she, we can be a little bit more queenie, because we're all faggots together. We can hug and kiss it. Though Martin speaks of the gender-bending banter of the group with affection, he's quick to inform me that he does not embrace all aspects of the gay culture. For example, he really does not like drag. He tried it once and he hates it. When asked about attitudes in Channing today towards gay people, have they changed over time, Martin recounts recent debates on same-sex marriage and gay ministers in the church. This opened up a dialogue within the town, which made him feel more welcome. However, he still feels safe. He feels safe, although he still is closeted. When it comes to treatment of homosexuality, he says Alberta is like living in the Dark Ages. About growing older, Martin is comfortable. He speaks with pride of his active sex life at age 78. His encounters include online sex with both younger and older men. His oldest lover is 84. His youngest is around 40. Most of his former partners and lovers have become part of his social network. Like other gay men, he fears having to move to an institution. He has a very specific fear about being found in a nursing home, not knowing what he's doing, and walking around doing something sexually inappropriate. This is a nagging fear of his. He welcomes the idea of a special place for older gay men like him in a nursing home. If he won the lottery, his goal would be to build a nursing home for older gay men to live. On my last visit with Martin, after he had worked through my summary of his life story, I asked him what he would like to do with it. Unlike John, he had no plans for it. He had no need to share his stories with others. In fact, he felt quite the opposite. I prompted him further. He explains by telling me that at one of his recent Breakfast Club meetings, he was asked by someone if he had thought about cleaning up his condo, just in case there was something to happen to him. The need to de-gay his apartment was something that he hadn't thought about. He has put some thought to this recently, and in fact started to name objects, books, photos, etc. that he knew he had to clean up. I tentatively suggested that this seemed rather unfortunate or really kind of sad in some ways, as much of what he's lived in the last 20 years would be wiped out, would be lost. He was not so sentimental as I. When I asked about his fears, or what his fears were related to, about leaving things behind, he responded quite strongly and firmly that it would not be fair to his grandson to know that his grandfather was a faggot. That's Martin's story. I'm hoping you have some time. I have my own observations on how I see queer theory and light course principles being reflected, but I would really be interested in hearing some of your thoughts or observations or impressions on John and Martin's stories. Take a moment. there striking differences for you between the two? Or did you get a different sense of who they were?
I thought that was especially interesting that Martin felt no qualms about cleaning up his apartment so that his grandson didn't have to know about his true self. Whereas John went out seeking and seemed much more open about who he was within his community. But then again, Martin didn't even realize until his 40s. So he had probably a whole different perspective on what his family thought of him, what he wanted them to think of him.
The timing of his coming out, for sure, because as he tells me, he was getting to know how to be gay. I think of Butler's performativity, learning how to be gay by the people related to him, around him. Which, for John, he always knew that he had same-sex desires and that those were different. He has not necessarily come out fully, but he's very comfortable with who he is. It's more of a don't ask, don't tell kind of stand.
But if he were really secure in who he was, then he would want his grandchild to know about him, and that would be the liberation, that he wouldn't have to suppress it. He could share it, and then know that there are different ways. So in some ways, he hasn't really come to terms with that.
Yeah, that was Martin. Yeah, John. I think Susan was talking about John, the first person, but Martin. Yeah. But if you can imagine what his view of what it means to be gay to other people means, he might have a sense of who he is, but he's thinking, my grandson might have this other image of who I am, and I don't want to go there. So yes, it's quite a tension. And he comes across as very accepting, having a wonderful life, loves his group of gay friends and connections, but it's very clear that he doesn't want that legacy passed on. So, which is...
But you've identified Martin as adaptations.
Yeah.
So that's a struggle for me, because there is that tension and there's that incongruence between who he presents himself to be and the way he lives and the true sense of self that he seems to feel, or that part that he rejects. So how is that happen?
I see Martin as someone who's adapted to survival in a small town as a closeted gay man.
Versus embracing who he really is.
Yeah, although he embraces who he is and loves it within his group when he's a certain way. And almost his entire social life has become his gay circle of friends. But throughout his life, he adapted by not coming out, by playing the game, by not flaunting it, which he thought was almost that was good judgment, right? To not express who he really was. Which, to me, he's adapting to a very hostile environment. Whereas John was a bit more, he resisted being told how he should act by both the gay community and the straight community. And more not just so much about who he has sex with, but how he spends his time and what he does. Because he has all kinds of, he does have an incredible array of nurturing qualities, and he's very busy. He's looking after lots of people, baking muffins for the people at the Royal Bank, those sorts of things, which are not typical. So he's resisted the notion of how he's supposed to be as a straight man, but also as a gay man. I guess that's where I see adaptation and resistance.
Sorry I missed the beginning, but I'm just curious how you came to select this small town location. Just reflecting on my work, which is also rural, very small, everyone knows everyone. So isn't it more difficult for both these men to survive there?
Well, and that's what my expectation of going there, because I'm from Drumheller originally, right? And I left, I ran away, I had to get out of there. So in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, how do you survive? How do you choose to stay in a place like this? What must your life be like? Who is your connection? How do you... Surprisingly, it's nice to be surprised, right? they're very engaged with their family, with their friends. They have a very rich social life, they have a very rich sex life. Yes, there were periods and times where it's been difficult, but they've also had the option of going away to connect with other, going to Calgary, going to Vancouver to meet, to connect with people, and coming back. So with John in particular, he had such strong roots in that community. Although he tried the big city, it was his roots and his connections in his home, and he wanted to make a living. When I look at it from my lens, I still think, why do you do what you do? Like, I couldn't do that. With Martin, he didn't name like discrimination in the fact that he had to butch it up, or keep his wrist straight, or play the game. He didn't recognize that as discrimination. I would. I see that as being limited.
So to me, both John and Martin are resistant.
Yeah.
They're resilient, resistant, but they've chosen this. So I don't see that. So I think it's for you to differentiate, and characterize them as you have. I think the adaptation needs more explanation. Because I see him really resisting as well, being resistant.
Yeah, Martin.
Yeah.
There certainly are aspects of it, for sure. Yeah, I have to think more about it.
I'm going to pick up a little bit on Laura's point, and the encapsulating each person's story with one word. In a way, that smacks of essentialism, and who these people really are. Do we ever really get at who people really are, and do we expect people to be just one thing, and who people are is driven by their sexuality or their aging or the fact that they're men, or it's more complicated than that, isn't it? So I guess it's from your participants unpacking and appreciating the diversity of the ways that they live and their living practices, given who their community has shaped their perceptions of who they are, but also who they feel they are within that community.
I absolutely agree. And I know when I first started off here, this thing that struck me most, I was looking sort of at a thematic analysis, and resistance and adaptation did come up. And these stories were, my lens was more around resistance, and my lens was more around adaptation. Absolutely, the full story, they are more than what comes across here. And when I was writing that down, it did feel like I was reducing them somewhat, for sure. Yeah, they are more. Although there are aspects of resistance that I see that come through so much stronger to me in John's life than Martin. I guess I need to play those ideas. And those are just that's one theme within many themes. But what is the relationship between adaptation and resistance? It's 1:15. I know technically we go till 1:30. I have a few more thoughts here. Do you have time? Do you want me to carry on, or do you have other?
I have a few more questions for you.
Oh, good. Well, let's go with your questions.
Do you want to do
Let's go with your questions.
Well, why don't you do your preliminary observations? Because it might cover some of those.
See if it does. So, first of all, I guess these are very sort of, and I'm in the middle of analysis, and those first observations. And there's actually another person I'm not telling you about who I'm still working through. There's another third. Her story is, again, quite different from a gender perspective. But this is the piece around the social networks, which, again, I expected. And when I told people I was going to Alberta to talk to older gay men living in farms, I said, how does that happen? How do they survive? And that's not what I got. Right? Rich networks, family, they had quite expansive community connections, which I found wonderful. It was great to see that. And I had no idea there was such a network, very hidden network, of gay men and women in some of these small towns, and online connections that made that more possible. Certainly all of them who I've spoken to have lived a much less structured life. They've had some freedom to do that, with the exception of Martin, who was married for a while. But they spoke about retiring many times and at different times, and doing things in order that people don't usually do them, like John's trip around history. He's at what looked like that typical post-university trip to Europe was his trip around North America at 44, where he, as he says, learned how to do what people do, learn when they're 19 or 20. Talked a little bit about the coming out process and how that has influenced them with Mark. We've already discussed that a little bit. Questions that come up, questions around performativity and performance, and I think about, particularly with Mark, and how the way he talks about how he learned how to be gay, and how he's learning how to be an old gay man in this sense. And then it made me think about what are the images, what are the, if you think of discourse as almost a menu of possibilities, unconscious though they are, what are the options out there, and who's shaping those? And I go back to the designer guys in the beginning, is do you have to be, does it the older gay man with the designer products and that whole sort of consumeristic lifestyle, which is certainly reinforced. But are there other options? In John's story in particular, just the way he was in his community, the role that he took on in his community, reminded me so much of descriptions of two-spirited people that you hear. Two-spirited people, Native First Nations culture, where gender is not seen as male and female. There's much more many possibilities. And two-spirited people are folks who take on the spirit of both feminine and female, and take on a variety of roles. That role, at least within traditional Native cultures and pre-colonialism, were celebrated and acknowledged. There was a place for them, which I thought was wonderful. When I look at John's life, he was there helping young kids. He was there helping dying parents and neighbors. He was there participating in religious kinds of rituals. His role as an uncle was huge, which the role of uncles with all of these folks was very much there, which is something that I sort of hold close to heart. There's a bit of my story coming into it. The resisting, adapting kind of questions, the pros and cons, how adaptive it would be to stay closeted in a setting like that at a time like that, and how very often people, when they go into places like nursing homes, recloset themselves again. That's an adaptive way of surviving. And the questions of crisis competence, which I have more about, is that there's been things written about gender management in old age, particularly for men, as they need to learn how to take on new roles. John taps into that a little bit in his stories around how he talks about an interaction with his nephew, where he knows they're playing all these macho games and he wants to shake hands. You don't have to do that. You can be this way. And he feels that his awareness of the games that people play has made him more able to deal with some of the issues of age. Of course, all kinds of questions around the role of sexuality in life transitions. So, his decision to leave the farm, although the prices were good, there was also this desire to go discover the big gay world. Decisions around work, where they're going to live, connections, friends, associations, so much of that. And it makes me think or realize how little, from my reading in the life course, sexuality doesn't come up as one of the key things around motivating transitions. And lots around rural-urban, what the differences, because this population's been studied so little. There's some discussion that older people who are disconnected from the urban gay community have a more positive sense of who they are. Because of that, there isn't that same sort of reminder that they're not young and beautiful and whatever. And I didn't get the same from these folks around that sort of older, younger thing that you hear right away when you talk to older gay men in an urban setting because of the presence of the culture. So that's, I think, something to further explore. Like small towns, you don't always have a choice who you hang around with, right? They're all kind of...
Did you, so you tapped into Nora Keating's study from Edmonton on where's the best place to grow old in Canada? And it wasn't Alberta. It was Saskatchewan.
Yeah, she
just published a little book on rural aging.
I don't know if I've heard of it, but I haven't.
So you should take a look. Like, she looked at the Stats Canada data from 2,759 small communities across Canada. Just massive. And then did some case studies. Don't know how she tackled the role of sexuality, but she certainly looked at gender. But also the support, the whole thing around social networks, family, community, and where do people want to grow old? They do want to grow old in smaller settings. So it'd be interesting just to see how, in those technical reports what she does with that. And I can give you the reference.
Yeah. That's it. Oh, of course, lots of questions around queer theory. I mean, it helps me think about certain things. It certainly doesn't explain it all. I think there's all kinds of questions that I have around. I'm not so sure that, yes, gender, identity, I can see how that's fluid. Sexual desire, yes, for some people it's fluid, but not for all people. There's something else there. And the notion that so many of the queer theorists really don't work with people or bodies, they work with text, and they work with film, and I can't get away from the body, the very real body we live in has some influence over how we do what we do and when we do it, in addition to discourse. So lots of questions there still. That's it. Thank you very much. I hope you have some questions still.
Can I throw a question at you?
Sure.
It comes back to your last slide, actually. If you were to imagine foregrounding queer theory in your research, what you feel that would allow you to explore in the narratives, and then to background queer theory and foreground, say, my course, whether if you move back and forth, whether you would be able to get a contrast, but also use the theory to help emerge, but also shape the limits of what you feel you cannot be able to think about.
I hate to ask you, but could you repeat, because we didn't quite catch what you said.
It's a volume control. Oh, geez, we need to start
trying
to, don't we? Sorry. I'll try and repeat that. So Barry, when I was interested in thinking about your queer theory, depends on how you use theory, but if you move queer theory forward and into your mind and you read the narratives, what that allows you to think about, what that opens up in the narratives, and then moving it back and moving different theory forward, so you can get a movement that will perhaps give you different emphases at different times, but also make you aware of where the limits of where the theory can take you.
Rather than an overall
yes,
lens
yes.
that shapes everything.
Yeah, I don't know whether that would help.
Yeah, that's helpful.
What does queer theory shut down? That's where your thinking is, isn't it? Like it doesn't let your participants free in that way.
And absolutely, and I was talking to Ardra, I felt like I was becoming a little bit of a fundamentalist queer theorist for a bit, trying to understand, to make sense of it, and then trying to sort of force fit it when it can't necessarily be force fit, but not throwing it out entirely.
What other kinds of theories might you be able to use that helps you to put the narratives in perspective?
Aging, theories on aging in particular? Or?
It doesn't have to be aging in particular.
I guess, I mean, theories on successful aging, right? Because I'm looking at growing older and what it means to grow older, and questions of not just satisfaction, but meaning and purpose and quality.
So not necessarily sexuality, because everybody faces that transition. And there's a group of people that we never ever talk about, which are asexual people.
Yeah.
People who grow old but have no sexual orientation and don't give a shit.
Yeah.
And there's another group too. I know in the interviews I did, it's really difficult for people who have disabilities, who are gay or lesbian, like fitting in. It's sort of like taboo, or not even thought of. And so what happens? Yeah, and the other thing I was going to say, I know Cheryl mentions this to me, that whole issue of successful aging. What is successful aging? And how do we fit people who are marginalized into something that's normative, but never even, considered them as being part of that process? Because if you age in a certain pattern, it's like, it's according to the life course, which is, you know, you grow up, you get married, you have children, and the way that unfolds, and that's not necessarily the way events are going to unfold as reflected in the stories that you presented.
It's interesting because I often ask them, well, all of them I have asked them, what does it mean to age successfully? What is successful aging? And there is a little bit of with all of them, it's they've got something that straight men don't. There's something there, and part of it is because they haven't gone through the regular thing, and they don't necessarily have the burdens or the difficulties. But according to Martin, he's just having so much more fun than his peers or friends.
But that may not necessarily be so.
Oh, it's absolutely, none of this is absolutely so, right? It's all, it's their take on it.
But, you know, how do you define successful aging? Because those of us who are aging and keep going and don't stop are not caught.
And then we usually define it within the confines of health. If you're healthy, like you're aging successfully. If you don't have illness, you're aging successfully.
Right.
So it's medicalized. You know, so that's why it's sort of hard, like, you know, what is aging? What is that? You know, when it really begins, like, from my perspective, from the researchers, it begins before 65. So what does that sort of encompass?
Interesting.
So, and I, you know, Cheryl would always, whenever I would say that, Cheryl Cost, my supervisor, she doesn't like the word successful, and now that I'm like addressing this, I understand why. I finally get it why.
But John, when I asked him about being older or old, he kind of didn't like the word, didn't want to go there. But whenever he talks about how he was able to keep up, or he was way ahead of most of his peers, people much younger than him. He now has a problem later with arthritis, but it's not aging; it's his knee. That separates the two.
But Frank Gehry, I just read a lovely article in the New Yorker where he's been riding a motorbike up until recently, and he says, as long as I don't look in the mirror, I'm not aging. You know, and he just keeps going, as so many of us do.
So thank you very much for coming. For your questions.
San Diego, she's